Start recording. All right, welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. This is our Biblical Scholarship and Literacy Adult Religious Education class. It's our 5th lecture, and today we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel, and we're going to introduce Abraham, and we'll have a discussion about historicity. So last time, we covered the documentary hypothesis, that's JEDP, and that theory. We'd been using it all along, but I gave an overview of the whole theory, where it comes from. We also talked about alternative approaches and the evolution of the theory, because there's been some challenge to the theory as it was originally stated. So we still think there are sources, but we think some of the dating of some of those sources of the original version might have been wrong, and the whole process was probably more complicated than we originally thought. And so I talked about some of those complications and some of those issues, and I told you that my approach in this class is going to be just the JEDP theory, kind of in its standard form, with an assumption that there are some more complicated things going on and that we don't always know the dating for some of the text. But that is my approach, and there are others. There are other people who reject it entirely. There are other versions of the theory, and then there's just very slight variations on it, and there's a lot of different versions out there. And then we covered Genesis 5 through 10, which gave us Cain and Abel, the sacrifice, and the flood story. And when we did the flood story, I showed you why people and myself believe that some variation of the JEDP theory is real, because you can take that flood story, strip it into two, and you get two complete stories minus the contradictions, each that use different vocabulary, different themes, and they're self-consistent, and they're self-consistent within their themes. And so the word usage, once you split it, is also self-consistent with the themes that show up in other passages that use the same set of words. And that makes us think there are multiple sources here. And that's what we did last time. And we ended with the discussion of the flood as myth. And I made the point that we shouldn't have to tell you this, but the flood story is a myth. We don't think it's necessarily historical, and that's how we ended the class. Today we're going to expand on that concept of mythology and what mythology means and how it relates to historicity a little bit. The other point I really should remind, because this was important for me, and we kind of ran out of time at the end, but this is a big deal for me because the flood story really is immoral. It sets up an immoral God who commits genocide because he's angry at the people for being themselves immoral. And so we can look at that and kind of judge the morality of God if we believe the story is real. But as I said, I think it's mythological. It's probably not real. But what I thought was interesting about the story is the evolution of God and the morality of God. Because the Canaanite, the Mesopotamian version of this story is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's a couple other versions. And in that version, God kills everybody because they're too loud. They're so loud that they're annoying to God, and he wipes them out. And the Israelite, and we're pretty sure the Israelite version borrowed from the Mesopotamian version, not the other way around. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the Israelite version takes the Mesopotamian version and layers onto it a morality story where it says that God destroyed the world because the people were themselves immoral. And so what we see in moving from the Mesopotamian version to the Israelite version is an evolution in the ethics. And yes, our ethics has then evolved again to the point where we say, well, even if people are immoral, you shouldn't murder them all. But there is still movement. And so I like to see these stories in kind of the context of Martin Luther's comment that the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And what we see in these stories is an evolution in moral thinking that progresses towards a ever more moral version of how the world works, how God works, and how humans and divine beings should all behave. So that was last week. I want to remind everyone we do have a website. It's sites.google.com. Unfortunately, /view/biblical scholarship and literacy. And in there, we've got a syllabus, and we have links to the lectures, the recordings I make, and we have links to the slides and to extra material you can go to learn more and that sort of thing. So I want to remind everyone that resource is there. I no longer stream my classes live. The quality wasn't good enough, but I do record them, and then a few days later, I will post them online, and you can go to those, and I'll update the webpage. So today, again, because we ended our last class with this discussion of the flood is a myth, and I shouldn't have to tell you that, it's not historical, it's not real, then I need to back up a little bit, and I need to tell you what I mean by the nature of mythology. What does it mean for something to be a myth? And do I use that in a derogatory sense? What do I mean when I say something is myth? And then we want to talk for a brief moment about the historicity of myth. So we always have kind of a topic of general discussion, and then we have a specific discussion of a piece of the religious text. So that'll be our general discussion. Today we're going to talk about mythology, what it is, why we care about it, how scholars of religion think about mythology. And then we'll dive into Genesis 9 through 10, the God of the covenant. We'll dive into Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And if there's time, we'll introduce Abraham, and we'll have a brief discussion about the historicity of Abraham to tie it all together. And we'll talk about whether he was a real person and what we think and why we know or don't know the answer to that question. So that's today. So let's talk briefly about the nature of mythology and the historicity of mythology and myths. So first I need to define what a myth is. And if you just kind of go to a general dictionary, there's usually two definitions, and they're not the same. One is, a myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, typically involving supernatural beings or events. That's the first definition of a myth. And when I use the term myth, I usually mean that phrase. I remember I was in a Facebook forum for people. It was called something like Recovering from Fundamentalism. And in that forum, I made this comment about, this biblical myth. And someone said, you shouldn't use that term because it's derogatory, because it means the second thing, a widely held but false idea or belief. As in, he wants to dispel the myth that sea kayaking is too risky or too strenuous, right? And so they're thinking in that term. Well, religious scholars almost never use the term to mean that. When we use the term myth, we usually mean it's a story that is meaning-making for people. It explains and gives them a sense of meaning or explains the world around them. So this myth explains, when we get to the Tower of Babel, why there's lots of different languages in the world. It's an explanation for why the world is how it is that then usually layers on some sort of meaning for the people who read the myth that says, well, this is how we should interact with the world because of this reason that the world is how it is. And so that's what I mean by myth. So when I say something is a myth, I mean the story has a purpose to create meaning, and it was designed to explain the world. I don't mean it's not historical. So the reason I don't mean it's not historical, I can, however, mean, let me back up, that it might not be historical, right? So a myth can be historical or it can be ahistorical. For example, I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree, is a myth. And what I mean by it's a myth is it's a meaning-making story that we use to explain the honesty of the founders of our nation, one of the specific founders of our nation, and we have tied our meaning as Americans up with that story. Did the story happen? Well, for our meaning-making, it doesn't matter whether the story happened. We just cut it off. So I wanted to warn you, I turned my mic off because we couldn't get everything muted like we wanted. So I turned that off and turned the mic off. Okay. So its historical or ahistorical point doesn't matter for the meaning-making that the myth is intended to create. But that doesn't mean it's not historical. And often, stories like that, which probably never happened as we tell it, are based on some kernel of truth. George Washington was a real person. He really exists. He really fought certain battles, and he did have a reputation for honesty. And that myth is designed to encapsulate that true kernel. So what that means is a myth can be based on a completely fabricated story that we make meaning out of, or it can be based on a historical narrative that we make meaning out of, or it can be based on a spin on a historical story. Columbus is another example. Columbus is a myth. We just celebrated Columbus Day. Our story about Columbus is a myth. It's designed to give this meaning for the discovery of America, right, by the West. And the problem is it's a spin because part of that story is true. And what do? We leave out all the parts we don't like. like the fact that he bought 12-year-old girls and sold them into the sex slave. That doesn't satisfy our myth of Christopher Columbus, so we leave it out. But that doesn't mean Christopher Columbus is a false, mythological, ahistorical person. He really lived. He really did sail across the ocean. Okay, so that kind of separates this idea of historicity from mythology. So when I say the flood is a myth, I mean it doesn't have to be historical. It's designed to create meaning, and then we can look at it in terms of the meaning it creates and set aside for a minute whether it really happened. But it also opens the door to saying whether it happened isn't the point of the story. It's not to tell history. It's not to tell us this history of the world flooding. That wasn't the point of the story. So what I believe, and I have a bias, and I'm going to admit my bias up front. My bias is that most myths that were told in the ancient world had some historical kernel behind them. They're spins on something that really happened. And now that's a bias, and I admit it, but I'm going to give you examples of why I have that bias. The first is Troy. Everyone was sure Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey were fiction. They're straight up fiction. Well, they're myth, and they're myth designed to create meaning for the people of the time, the Greek-speaking world. And it turns out some archaeologists started digging, and they found a city, and they're pretty darn sure that's Troy, and sure enough, there was a war there, and it's a myth based on real historical events. Now, there probably wasn't a guy dipped in dragon's blood named Achilles who could only be killed by being, stuck through the foot. Or maybe there was a guy named Achilles, but the stories we tell about him probably didn't happen quite the way Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey says. But there really was a place, there really was a war, and there might have even been a real lady named Helen. Who knows? And so this is, again, my bias, and this is one of the reasons. People thought Troy was a completely fictitious place, and it wasn't. It was based on a real event. The other one is the flood, of course, and there is this theory that the Black Sea had descended below sea level, and then there was a very sudden inundation where the water rushed through the isthmus and filled the lake in a very cataclysmic flood. And some people have said, well, maybe the flood story of Noah is based on memories of this event. Now, it turns out that there's an ongoing geological debate about whether this ever happened. We don't even know. And I kind of want to point that out, that this is one of those speculative things. But what we do know is that the Mesopotamian river valley with the Tigris and Euphrates River was subject to constant floods. We have for sure evidence of the cities there having been flooded on occasion and then built over the top of the floods, when these rivers would overflow their banks, flood the cities, and they would rebuild their cities. And we believe that the story of the flood comes from Mesopotamia. And these people were subject to constant floods, and there might have even been somebody who could tell that a flood was coming, maybe because it was raining upstream, and he protected himself and his family. Maybe his name was Utnapishtim, maybe it was Noah, but whoever it was, you can imagine this whole story and myth being based on a kernel of historical truth. So again, my point is, when I say something's a myth, I mean we don't have to believe the whole earth was covered with a flood. I don't mean there was never a person who was in a flood and that story was perpetuated and based on some kernel of something that maybe actually happened. So there's others. Some people have compared the story of the fall of Adam and Eve to the rise of agriculture. It's a memory, they say, of the rise of agriculture, because actually the rise of agriculture was very traumatic. People's life expectancy went down, not up, and they had to work in the fields, and it was a very hard and difficult thing, and it wasn't actually all the good step forward people think. And so the move from hunter-gatherers, who just kind of picked from the trees as they moved, to a place where you had to work for the sweat of your brow, so people have compared the fall of Adam and Eve to a memory of that story. The other, of course, is the Tower of Babel, which we'll discuss today, which is based on the building of ziggurats in Babylon. We also have Abraham and his wife or sister. We'll talk about that one today. But then we have Moses and the Midianite god Yahweh. Turns out Yahweh is a real Midianite god. And there's this passage in the Exodus where Moses shows up, marries a Midianite lady who is the daughter of the high priest of Midian. And then he goes up a mountain and sees a vision of God. And God says, oh, by the way, my name is Yahweh, and you didn't know that. You always called me El. But my real name is Yahweh, and you should know that because we're the same being. And that sounds an awful lot like something that probably happened to one degree or another, because that would explain how El, the god El, and the god Yahweh got stuck together when a guy was hanging out in Midian, where they worshipped Yahweh, and he married into the family. So then we get the more interesting one to kind of follow is this search for the historical Jesus. Right? So there's a whole bunch of books. There's a whole series of books written on finding the historical Jesus. And they're based on the idea that there really was a guy named Jesus who really lived, probably wasn't resurrected from the dead, probably didn't walk on water, probably didn't feed 5,000 people with a loaf of bread, but he was a real guy, taught, was killed, etc. Now, that idea is great. In fact, Anne gave a sermon where she talked about this historical Jesus, where she talked about who this guy probably really was. And I remember that sermon. It was great. It was a lot of fun. But the caution that we ought to give is that the fact that whenever anyone does this, searches for the historical Jesus, they come up with wildly different stories about who Jesus was. And the fact that they aren't converging to a single answer probably means that we don't really know. So everything they say ought to probably be taken with a grain of salt. But the point is, it's another example of what I've described, of a myth that people are assuming had some historical kernel. Now, there are people who claim Jesus never existed at all, and it was all mythological, all made up with no historical kernel. But there's a lot of people who think there probably really was a guy named Jesus. And so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about historical kernels to myths. So let's apply that to the biblical historicity and ask the question, when does the biblical historicity shift from myth without kernel to myth with kernel and then to real history with spin? And so let's go through the kind of, and by the way, I can't answer that question, but I'm going to show you what a lot of people think. If you're a fundamentalist, then you believe the mythical creation and the mythical history, what I'm calling the mythical history, was literal. That's what makes you a fundamentalist. So that's from the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, down to the Tower of Babel. And that chunk is the chunk that fundamentalists will believe is real history. If you go to Answers in Genesis, for example, that really notorious webpage, which I ask you all not to go to because it's full of nonsense. Well, you can read nonsense if it makes you laugh, but that's a fundamentalist view, that all of this is historical. Then you get the family history, which is from Abraham to Moses. If you're a maximalist, you believe that that is either historical or has historical kernels in it. That's the maximalist view. Then you get the national origins story. This is the Exodus to David and Solomon. We actually have counter evidence for some of this. David and Solomon claims to rule this huge territory, and we know from contemporary documents that there were other kingdoms in the way that weren't actually being ruled by foreigners at the time. And so that's actually counter evidence to some of that. But if, again, a fundamentalist would say, the Bible's right, the evidence is wrong. But this national origins raises an interesting question. Is David even a real person? We have the same problem. Did David even exist? Or is he just a myth? And when I say just a myth, we're saying just a meaning-making story without historical kernels. So what meaning did they make out of the David and Solomon story? That's their national story of their past greatness that they're constantly trying to recapture. It's a meaning-making story. Political implications about the past greatness of Israel. So we know it's a meaning-making story. The question is, how much of it is real? How much of it is historical? Well, again, there can be historical kernels there, but it can't be quite as the Bible describes. Then we get the historical narrative. This is from the divided monarchy. And after a few of the divided monarchy kings, we have external biblical sources saying and pointing at these events. So at this point, the Bible connects with what we can call real history because we have external verification that these events really happened. So I remember someone else asked me a question, is the Bible, is it real or is it all just made up? And I said, well, that depends on which part of the Bible and what you mean and what you mean by made up. And so here's my take on these 4 sections. The mythical history is probably mythical, but there could be memories from the flood and from some of this stuff. When we get into the family history, I think there's probably something there. I'm one of those people who think that there probably was a guy named Abraham, but some of the stories we tell about him probably aren't real. The same when I get to Moses. I think that the story of the Exodus with thousands and thousands of people leaving Egypt is impossible, but a few escaped slaves isn't. And then we get the national origin story. Same thing. I believe it's non-historical but has historical kernels. David, Solomon, I think they were probably real kings. The story of how much land they controlled and how great their kingdom is probably a wild exaggeration. I'm telling you my bias, not saying, and I have this bias with a whole slew of uncertainty. meaning I'm willing to have my mind changed at the drop of a hat because I don't actually know these things. These are things I just suspect. And then once we get into the historical narrative with the divided monarchy, the events are real. We know that. There's actual extra-biblical sources describing them. However, they are best described as history with a spin. So this is the Columbus stories. Just like we tell these stories of Columbus, and I describe that as history with a spin to tell this great story of where we came from, that's the same thing that's happening here. We get the Israelite history with a spin, with political implications and motivations. The other thing to point out is that accurate dating appears during the time of the kings and not before. And the reason for that is because the kings started keeping scribes, and the scribes would write down during the reign of such and such a king. So from that point on, the dating is accurate. If the other pieces had historical kernels to them, I reject the dating of all of that because the Bible doesn't know. No one was keeping track. They may have remembered their genealogy, but they probably didn't remember the dates when things happened. You'll also notice that this whole bit with people living for 900 years, that's when that kind of tails off. People stop living a crazy amount of time right when they start keeping records of when people were born and when they died. Go figure. Now, I should also point out that there is a Mesopotamian tradition of the great early kings of Mesopotamia in their king lists living a long time. So when the Israelites generated their story about their great past patriarchs and kings, they did what the Mesopotamians did, and that is they created long lives for those people. But that's probably, again, an inaccurate sort of thing. Go ahead, David.
Just a comment on that. I have read that a speculation that the lengthening of lives, I mean, the stuff from before the flood was just kind of, is supposed to be kind of an extension of this, right?
Yeah.
But that after the flood, that what they were trying to do was to push the flood narrative far enough back that it didn't conflict with the Egyptian histories.
That's almost certainly true. So, okay, so for those who didn't hear, what David said is that if you have a traditional genealogy going back to the flood, but you go to Egypt and you have records of the kings that go further back, you've got to push the flood back further, and you can't just add people to your genealogy, so you have the genealogy, you lengthen them so they live longer to try to push the flood back to a time when you don't have Egyptian histories that would conflict with it. Now, I should point out they failed. If you take the traditional biblical chronology, the flood happened at about the reign of Teddy. And I've actually been to Teddy's tomb, stood in his tomb and read the writing on his wall, and I would really like to know who buried Teddy. And again, I bring that up just as one of those kind of ribs at fundamentalism. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so let's talk about the God of the covenant and the Noahide covenant. So in Genesis chapter 9, the flood is over, and in chapter 9, Noah goes out, offers sacrifice to God. God smells the sweet savor, and God comes down and makes a covenant with Noah, including commandments, where he says, you're not supposed to eat food with meat in it. If people murder, then their life should be taken. And he gives them a list of commandments, and traditionally the Jews will list seven Noahide commandments. And then God's part in all this is he promises that he will never destroy all the world again by flood. And he makes a sign for the covenant, which is the rainbow. Now again, this is a meaning-making myth because it explains why rainbows appear in the sky. Every time you see one, it's God proving that reminding you that he promised never to flood the world again. So when it rains, God reminds you that he'll never flood the world. So it's a meaning-making story, but it also is very important because Israelite theology is about monotheism. At least that's where it heads. And so this is the covenant. So this is the first kind of covenant that God makes that we have these records of, where God asks things of people, gives them commandments, and promises things in return. And this will become incredibly important during Abraham. But it also sets up the entire reason that Israel moves from henotheism to monolatry. So by henotheism, I mean a belief in many gods, but a belief that one God is supreme. That was common in the ancient world. But monolatry is the belief that you should only worship one God while believing the other gods exist. Whereas monotheism is the belief that the other gods don't exist. Israelite moves through those stages, from polytheism to henotheism to monolatry, and finally during the exile to monotheism. And the way they make that move from henotheism, the belief there are lots of gods, but one is better than the others, to monolatry, where you just only worship that one who's better and not the others, is this idea of covenant. In these stories, again, not during the Noah story, but it sets it up. In these stories, God comes down and asks a covenant of people where he essentially says, the other gods exist, they're great, but I want you to worship only me, and I want you to promise in covenant to worship only me. That's monolatry. And if you do that, I will give you certain blessings, and it's associated with marriage. So just like a woman can marry a man could have more than one husband, more than one wife at the time, so I apologize for the sexism of the past, but a woman could only marry one man, and she wasn't supposed to have sex with anyone else. Because if she did, she might have a kid that wasn't the child of the other guy, and that kid would inherit, and that would be theft. And so women, it's not so much that women were seen as property, as women were seen as heir producers, and thus tied to property and property rights. But this idea that sex outside of marriage was a sort of theft, a break of a covenant, a marriage covenant, was connected with this idea of God as a covenant being in a covenant relationship with Israel as a special people who are only supposed to worship that one God. And so this story sets up God as a God of covenant, of interrelated promises. And that idea will morph into the monolatry of Israel, which will become monotheism. So it's incredibly important for the development of monotheism to see this early statement of God as a covenant being. And then we get this great and confusing and crazy story of Ham. And now I got to tell this story because it's very important for social justice issues and for the history of the United States view of slavery. So we've got to tell this story. So what happens in this story is Noah has 3 kids, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Ham, and he plants a vineyard. And the Bible actually says he's the first person to make wine. And he gets drunk, probably not even knowing what happens when you drink too much wine. So he makes wine, he likes it, he drinks a bunch of it, he ends up drunk. And he ends up so drunk that he ends up passed out on the ground naked. So Noah, his name means rest, and there's actually this connection between wine and rest and joy, and because it makes people loopy and happy. And so Noah, being the first winemaker, also is the first person to get drunk, passed out drunk, and Ham walks in and looks at his dad and goes, wow, Dad's naked. And then he walks out and he tells his brothers, hey, Dad's passed out in the tent naked. And the brothers wander in backwards with a cloth, and they cover their father with this garment, and they don't look at his naked body. So his dad wakes up, and I'm going to read the story. His dad wakes up, finds out what happened, and it says, let me see, I got to find the right place. I'm in the Abraham story. Hold on, let me back up a couple chapters. Chapter 9. I'm in chapter 9, verse 25. He said, cursed be Canaan, lowest of the slaves shall he be to his brothers. Now, Canaan is the grandson of Ham, son of Ham. Third grandson? Yeah, so I'll show you the genealogy in a minute. I actually don't know. But it's not Ham. He doesn't curse Ham. He curses one of Ham's kids. Really weird. And lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. And he said, blessed be by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. And may God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. Well, so Canaan is like I said, he's a ancestor of Ham. So here's the genealogy. I know it's going to be probably really hard to read, but we have Noah at the top, and the 3 kids, Japheth, Shem. We have Noah at the top. We have the 3 kids, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, and then their kids, and Canaan is down here. And Canaan, it so happens, this is all of chapter 10. So chapter 10 lays out this genealogy. Now, we call this the Table of Nations because, again, we are making a bridge from the creation to the real memory, at least, they had of a guy named Abraham. And they want to tie that family history to the world's history. And to do that, they tell the ancestry of Noah as he spreads out and populates the entire world. And so and then Canaan is cursed. And Canaan has these kids. And if we look at these names tie Hivites, the Amorites, these names match names we actually know from the land of Canaan. So Canaan is the one who is cursed, not Ham, and the reason is political. The writer of the story is trying to make the point that the Israelites had a justification for taking the land of Canaan from the Canaanites. He's justifying the conquest through this is a myth. And by myth, I mean a story with meaning, designed to create meaning, and in this case, political meaning. He's justifying the conquest. Now, he doesn't curse Ham's other kids. Now, why that's important for us today is that Ham's other kids settle in places like Cush and Put, and these are places that we believe are down in Egypt, or next to Egypt. In other words, Africa.
Well, also, Mitzrayim, Egypt.
Yeah, and there's one actually mentions Mitzrayim in Egypt.
Is where the Sudan now is.
So what we have here is a person who is the descendant of the Canaanites who were conquered, and a text trying to justify their conquest, tied also to Africa. And 18th century Americans will notice this, and they'll apply the curse to all of Ham's descendants. We'll say this is where black skin came from, and this is why the black people are slaves, and that we white people have a right as descendants of Japheth, so they say. So Shem was the Jews, and then Japheth was the Gentiles, and Ham was the people of African descent. And they will make the point that this is why the African people deserve to be enslaved and why we have to keep them as slaves, because it's God's will. Again, I think it's really important to note that when these stories were created, they were designed to explain a reality that already existed, the slavery the conquest of Canaan. And they're not really stories that are designed to tell us the world how God wants it to be. And so when you apply that to, God wants us all to be wants all Africans to be slaves, that's a misapplication of the text. It's also historically inaccurate. As I said, the people who settle in Africa are not the slaves. It's Canaan, and their skin wasn't black. So none of this makes any sense, but it doesn't have to make sense for somebody to take a story and make it mean what they want it to mean so that they can justify either social justice or social injustice, because you can make the text mean what you want it to mean to justify what you want it to believe. And here's an example of how that was done, which is why we had to tell that story. Go ahead, David.
I just wanted to say another thing I've read that's interesting is that there's indications that to the ancient Israelites, at least at some quite early point, that the dividing line was not the Isthmus of Suez. It was the Rift Valley, that's the extension of the Gulf of Aqaba, as it goes north through the Dead Sea up to Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And to them, that's the dividing line. And it is the dividing line mostly between the stated nations of Shem and Ham.
So let me pull up a map, actually. And I guess I don't have the map. I wonder where it went. I thought I had a map. If you look at Japheth and Shem, at least, they're spread out. And then there's some Canaanite descendants that are also split out. Each one gets a different city, and they're mixed up.
Yeah, they are mixed up in places.
But I actually don't know where they saw the dividing line. I know where they saw kind of the dividing lines of their nation, but that's a different issue. So we need to go on.
Okay.
But what I want you to know is when you see there's a bunch of now terms that will be defined based on this genealogy. So the genealogy matters for defining terms later on in the biblical text. So for example, Shem becomes the ancestor of the Semites, and these are actually a linguistic group of people that really exist. There's a Semitic language group. It just so happens the Canaanites are part of that group. That's the other bit that's wrong. The Canaanites are not descended from Ham. They're part of the Semitic language group, if we trace this linguistically. But that's the descendants of Shem. And then we get this guy named Eber, which people think is related to Hebrews, maybe. And that becomes everyone who is a descendant of him are the Hebrews. So when they talk about the Hebrews, the Bible, the Jews almost never refer to themselves as Hebrews, but outsiders will refer to them as Hebrews, probably meaning either there's actually a Canaanite word where it could mean outsider, actually, Or it could just mean a descendant of Eber, and so one of these, part of this family, this descendant of Heber, which is a subfamily of Shem. And that brings us down to Abraham, which we further divide. This is Haram's kids, who was Abraham's brother, which is where Lot comes from. Lot is going to be important to our Abraham story. And then we get Abraham has a son, Isaac, who has 2 kids, Jacob and Esau. Esau will be the parent of the Edomites, and so Jacob and Esau's relationship will mirror Israel and the Edomites' relationship. Again, it's a meaning-making story to explain the relationship between those 2 competing tribes of people. And then under them we get Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, who becomes the parent of 13 kids, and those become the Israelites. One of them is named Judah, and he becomes the Jews. And him and the other tribes that live with him, and we get the name Jew from that, the name Israelite from Jacob's name, the name Hebrew from Eber. And so that's when this table of nations sets up the names that become important for the different peoples that we'll deal with in the rest of the biblical text. So the genealogy, I don't expect you to memorize it. It's not, that part isn't important, but it sets up the groups of people that we'll be dealing with at a later date. So let's do the Tower of Babel, and then we're gonna quickly run out of time. So the Tower of Babel is a very, very weird and kind of fascinating story. It shows up in chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone, and bitumen they had for mortar. So among other things, this is a story of pride in a new technological achievement. In this case, burnt bricks that allowed them to build really big towers. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." 2 things are happening with name. Shem, his name means name. Name is also synonymous in Hebrew with fame, and most of the ancient Near East, actually. If you make a name for yourself, people remember your name, so you have achieved fame. So these people are trying to achieve fame and a name, and this will be contrasted with Abraham, who is set up as the ancestor and heir of Shem. The genealogies create in Abraham the heir line of Shem. So the Jews are claiming that we are the descendants of Abraham. Abraham is the heir of Shem, and Shem was blessed by God and Noah during that moment we told about earlier when Ham was cursed. So Shem was blessed. Abraham is his heir. And the people in Babylon tried to set up a name for themselves. And remember, the Jews and the Israelites are a very small underdog tribe, but they're creating a family history that makes them the heirs of greatness. And they're going to contrast themselves with the Babylonians in this moment, who try to make a name for themselves. And they said, look, and then in verse 5, it gets really weird because the Lord God came down to see the city and the tower that the mortals had built. And the Lord said, look, the people, they have all one language, and this is the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. Now this is, again, a story told by Jay. Jay is the same one who said, we need to put a cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way of the tree of life, because if they take out their hand and eat the tree of life and live forever, that'll be bad. So we need to stop them from doing that. And again, that same idea of God coming down and stopping the people from achieving something that God doesn't want them to achieve is in this story as well, again, by the same sort of author and source. So come, let us go down, and we will confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the whole earth, and they left off from building the city. Now the other theme here is scattering. So you know how I like to do the comparative religion thing where I say every religious tradition proposes a problem and a solution. One of the core problems in Israelite theology is scattering, exile. And one of the core solutions is, how do you worship God and stay a people with a name and a fame and in memory during an exile? And eventually, how do you return home to your land and rebuild your city that was destroyed. So it's exile and return is one of the core themes of Judaism. And so here we see the second instance of scattering. The first was Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden, and the second is here when the Tower of Babel is, the languages are confused and they are scattered. Wherefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad on the face of all the earth. Now I want to make a couple points about Babel. The name Babel means in English to babble, to say nonsense. It means that in English because that's what it meant in Hebrew and because of this story. He called it Babel because there he confused their languages. To have a confused language is to babble. The name Babylon, and there they built a tower. It turns out in Babylon we actually have these structures called ziggurats. This is an early picture of what it looked like. This is a reconstruction, I believe, done by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And what they are is stairways up to heaven. And at the top, you build a temple, so that the temple is at the top, up elevated by heaven. So the Jews are telling a story about a people who used mud baked bricks, like those in the picture, to build a tower whose top could reach to heaven, and there they would build their temple. This is what the Babylonians really did. Babel sounds like Babylon. So there's a play on words here. Babel, because he confused their language in Hebrew, to explain what was going on in Babylon, where the people really did build a tower and tried to get to heaven. The term Babylon is thought to derive from Bavelim, which in the Akkadian language of the time meant the gate of God or the gate of the gods. Babylon, as we say it today, comes through the Greek, is a Greek corruption of that. And so the place is named, they called it themselves the gate of God. This is the tower that reaches to heaven. That's how they thought of it. And the Israelites are making a polemic against the Babylonian religion. And again, the Israelites are trying to set themselves up as the heirs of Shem, the people of name, the people of renown, who are actually underdogs but the true heirs. And they're talking about this failure of the Babylonians, probably thinking of a real structure that really existed, where the Babylonians tried to reach heaven and failed, according to the story. And then they tie that to the origin of language. You see, the reason the Babylonians failed to actually reach heaven is because God confounded the language, and that's why everyone speaks a different language today. So again, that part is a myth-making because it's intending to create meaning. In this case, where did languages come from? Why don't we all speak the same language? Well, it's because God confounded the languages. Now again, when we're faced with the question of historicity, what we find in this story is a kernel of historical truth. There really was a place named Babylon. They really did build a tower whose top could reach to heaven, they thought. They really did think of it as the gateway to the gods. It really happened. It really existed. But it is not the origin of languages. Again, that last part should be obvious to everyone, but I have to make the point because fundamentalists exist. And that's, again, the problem we have with these texts, is the fundamentalist interpretation. Let me switch to here. This is how we believe languages really came to exist. We have family trees, and this is just the Indo-European family tree, but they evolved from each other, and we have over here the Ugaritic branch of the Indo-European tree. It's vaguely related. We have Indo-European tree, and up here we have Indic. Yeah, and so over here, European, the Romance languages, the Slavic languages, the Germanic languages, and English is over here.
I didn't think they were
Belgian, etc.
Uralics.
We're not sure exactly how they're connected. That's why they're kind of off there on the side. So what's interesting about that is if you trace the origin of this. Now, I'm going to come back to Teddy's tomb. I've stood in Teddy's tomb, and at the time, I could almost read Egyptian, not really well, but almost, and I've forgotten. It's all leaked out of my ears. But at the time, I stood there and I read the writing on the wall, and gosh dang it, they didn't speak the same language, because those people are speaking Egyptian back then, before the flood, right? If you just take this literally. Languages evolved, and we think we can trace, to some extent, the language families with the actual migrations of real people. And they go back thousands and thousands, and if you go back into genetic attempts to trace migrations, millions of years. And the reason we speak different languages is evolution. exactly the same sort of thing we see in Darwinian evolution. You separate two groups of people and random mutations in the language accumulate until they are no longer capable of talking to each other. That's speciation. And now you have two languages. And they're much, much older than the Tower of Babel. So again, this is a meaning-making story, but one not one actually connected to real kernels of historical events, but not literally true in every historical sense. So again, this is the same pattern I like to see. Now, this idea, once we understand it and understand what's happening in the Tower of Babylon story, it will make sense of Jacob's ladder story. Again, it's translated Jacob's ladder because if you remember, he is leaving Israel and he has a dream where he sees a ladder set up to heaven, to reach to heaven. Well, we call it a ladder because that's what the King James translated, but it's a ziggurat, it's a stairway. And so he is seeing a Babylonian temple as he's leaving Israel and heading towards the Babylonians. He sees a Babylonian temple whose top reaches heaven, and he sees angels descending on it, and there's people actually coming and going from heaven. It's functioning as the gate of God. And he wakes up from his dream and he says, this place is amazing. I didn't realize it. It's really the house of God, the Bethel. And there he sets up a pillar and a temple at Bethel because that's the house of God, because there he had a dream of a ziggurat. So again, we'll come to that story when we get to it, but the way the stories are connected with their historical kernels is incredibly important. So that brings us to Abraham. So we are not going to tell the story of Abraham here. There is no time, and I didn't intend to. I just want to introduce Abraham in the context of this question of historicity and dating and kernels of historical truth. To do that, I'll have to refer to some of the stories of Abraham, but we're not going to tell them in detail. When we come back next month, we will tell the Abraham story up through the sacrifice of his son Isaac. But here I just want to ask the question. I want to tell you briefly who Abraham is, what his importance is, and ask the question, who was he, and can we find a historical Abraham? Is there a way to search for the historical Abraham, the way people search for the historical Jesus? And I already told you that effort is fraught with difficulty, but we're gonna play the game anyway. But when we do, we're gonna try to set it aside with a certain amount of uncertainty and humility because we don't know if we're right. So who is this Abraham character? Well, first you got to figure out when he lived, and you don't even ask a question of dating a text until you decide the text is historical to some degree. Otherwise, the dating makes no sense. So as soon as you ask the question, when did Abraham live, you're already kind of asking the question, who was he and really? Well, dates for Abraham range from about 2000 BCE to 1400 BCE. That's the range I've seen scholars give dates for. Now, which one you believe is not as important. The point is, you can get at either date if you want. And here's how they do that. So let's get the early date. Well, the first thing is you take the divided monarchy where we have accurate dates. You pull those back to the Exodus. That's already fraught with difficulty because we're in undated territory. But most people date the Exodus to about 12,000 BCE if it happened at all. That's about when it probably happened. But let's just take that date and assume it's right for a minute. That's one of the weak links, but let's just start with the Exodus. If you just take the dates for how long the patriarchs lived, you end up with 400 years of captivity in Egypt. The text actually says they were captive in Egypt for 400 years. And if you then look at how long the people lived, you end up with 100 years prior to the captivity where Joseph and his family lived there before they became slaves. That gives you about 500 years. You get 300 years from Abraham to Joseph because they lived a long time. And that gets you 2000 BCE. The problem with that dating is that it depends entirely on these people living a heck of a long time, which we already said we're not sure we believe. So you either have to believe fundamentalist-like, that these people really lived a long time, or you have to think there were extra generations of people in there that we don't have any record of. And yet they have this complicated genealogy, spelling out every person back all the way, and supposedly somewhere you got to split that genealogy, pry it apart, and add like 20 generations of some, I exaggerate, a whole bunch of generations of people in there somewhere with no record of them or no genealogy from them. And to me, if this story has any historical kernel to it, that's probably not true. So if you do it another way, and this is the way you get the early date, let's start again with 12,000 BC or 1200 BC for the Exodus. Then you have genealogy to get to the Exodus. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moses. That's 7 generations. Okay? If you take about 25 to 30 years per generation, And by the way, that genealogy is supported. There's at least 3 other people in the Exodus story who their full genealogy back to Abraham is given, and they all have about the same number, 7 or 8 generations, every single time. If you just take 25 to 30 years per generation, even if you assume Abraham was old when he had his last kid, that puts Abraham at about 14, at kind of the earliest, 100 BCE. Now, again, I'm going to state my bias here, and there are problems with any approach you take to this, but my bias is people knew their genealogies much better than they knew their dates, because no one was keeping track of dates, as I told you, until the divided monarchy had scribes who were keeping track of the 5th year of the reign of so-and-so, which means all the dating before that is suspect. That doesn't mean the genealogy before that is, because people, if you go to the Middle East today, you can go to especially the Bedouins out in the wilderness herding sheep. These are the sort of people we're talking about. And today you can ask them for their genealogy, and they will give their male line back 10 generations from memory. And then you will ask them how old their son is. And they'll say, 30, 40 years, I don't know. And he'll be 13. I mean, this is part of the culture, and we assume that culture goes back. So again, I do not know. I'm not claiming the early date, because I know I had that conversation once with David, and he gave me all sorts of reasons it can't be right. Fine. I'm not claiming the early date, but somewhere between 2000 and 1400 is probably where we should put Abraham. And I will say the early date makes a little bit more sense to me, because the late date, I apologize. The late date makes a little more sense to me because I trust the genealogy a little more than I trust the dating of these people. Again, that assumes Abraham was a real person with a kernel of historical truth behind it. I don't even know that for sure. But if he existed, he probably lived a little bit later than certainly the fundamentalist approach would date him, because those people did not live as long as they're claiming. Okay, the next is, where does he live? He names his home Ur of the Chaldees, or the Chaldee, depending on which text you're reading, and we don't know where that is. But there is a big city called Ur. Ur is very famous. It's down here. Incredibly famous city, but they call it Ur of the Chaldees. That's almost like London, Ontario. I mean, you don't tack the other bit on unless you're trying to say it's a different Ur. And that gives us, it turns out there's another Ur up here near Turkey in northern Syria. And we think this might be Ur of the Chaldee, and there's several reasons for that. One is it's next to Haran, and we know that Abraham stops in Haran. Haran is kind of on the way. If you're coming from here, it's not really on the way because you got to go all the way up and down. Of course, you go here, you got to cross the desert, so maybe. But Haran is on the way from Ur, and when Abraham's descendants go back to visit with their ancestors to pick up wives, usually, they go to Aram, which is up here, which means Abraham's family lives up here. And so we guess that Abraham probably came from the northern country, Ur of the Chaldees. That's probably northern Ur. Now, again, why do I care about where he lived? Because it doesn't matter to the story too much. Well, it does, for 2 reasons. One, Ur is down here by Babylon. It's part of the Babylonian sphere of influence. If Abraham is from here, then you get a really neat loop in the story. The story of Abraham and the children of Israel begins in Babylon. God calls them from Babylon, brings them to Israel. There they live as God intended, hopefully more or less, until through their unwillingness to keep the covenant to worship only one God, they are captured and brought back to Babylon, where they started from. In other words, this Ur gives you a nice, neat loop to the story. And it's entirely possible, and I believe, the later biblical authors thought that's where Abraham was from, and so they tied that loop nicely and intended it. I think Abraham was actually from up here. The later authors might not have known that because this city might have vanished from their kind of collective memory by that time. But I think he probably lived from there, and that's important because it creates historical context. If I'm looking for the historical Abraham, I want to know the culture that influenced him, and then I want to look for that culture in the text because that tells me there's some truth to what's going on in the text. It turns out we have a whole bunch of tablets and texts and records and law codes from that area, from that time period. And those matter because now I can talk about some tie-ins between that culture and Abraham. For example, there are at least 2 Ugaritic stories about kings who are searching for an heir and can't find one. So it's a popular motif from the time, and here we have the story of Abraham who has no heir and is off looking for one. Eleazar is said to be Abraham's heir in Genesis 15. And Abraham, when he's promised all this grand children and nations, and he says, well, that's great. Eleazar is my heir. I assume he'll be the beneficiary of all these promises. God says, no, it'll be your own kid. Well, where is that coming from? It turns out that people in northern Hurrian nations needed an heir to take care of their funeral, to take care of their tombs, to do all these things that were very important to them. That's why having an heir was so important. That's why the view of women we talked about earlier and having a child that was really yours mattered. And if they had no heir and they were wealthy, their steward, their chief servant, was supposed to play the role of their heir. We know that from these Hurrian texts, and it makes sense of Genesis 15 for us. The other one is Hurrian marriage contracts include, almost always, I don't know about almost always, they often include a provision where they say, if you have no children, you, the woman who has no children, will give your servant to your husband as his spouse so that he can have children, because he needs children to make an heir. Your primary job in the marriage contract is to produce an heir. If you don't do that, you're supposed to give your servant to him so that he can have an heir, and that happens in the text, and it matches very closely with this contract. We're out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through these last one, but also there's extra importance for someone who marries their sister. We think that's where the sister thing comes from in the Abraham story. Sarai is his sister, and he's constantly passing her off as his sister. It turns out the texts misinterpret the reason that Abraham having married his sister is important, which tells me this is what you see in stories with kernels of truth, where you have a storyteller who preserves the kernel but has no clue why it's there and then gets it wrong, which implies that there was really maybe something there. And we see that in the Hurrian context for marriage. It actually contradicts the laws in Leviticus. In Leviticus, it's against the law to marry your sister. No Israelite would have made up that story, but a Hurrian would have. So Genesis 14, we get Abraham as the warlord who gives tithes to a king who is a Canaanite king, who he wants to convince that he's not trying to encroach on his territory. So he fights a war on this king's territory, and then he goes to that king and pays him tithes. Again, that is a story that fits in the context. The city names in that story also match an early 14th to 2000 BC setting for that story, whereas those cities, a lot of them don't exist by the time the later biblical authors tell the story. So they're remembering real city names that didn't exist anymore, etc. And we get this path through henotheism to monolatry to monotheism, and the story even preserves some of Abraham's henotheistic and monolatristic tendencies. In fact, he goes to the Canaanite king, and there he's blessed by El Elyon, who happens to be a real Canaanite god, and Abraham doesn't bat an eye. But again, a later Jewish person might not have written that story. It wouldn't have made sense to them. So these are the reasons that I think maybe there's some kernel of historicity to the Abraham story. Again, it doesn't matter. To some extent, it doesn't matter. I think it's an interesting question. But it doesn't matter because the story itself is moving. And it has moved people for thousands of years. So next time, we're going to tell that story. And it begins with the words, Sarai, his wife, was barren. And we're going to take that story through the creation of an heir, through a false hope, finally to a crash, where God commands him to sacrifice his son, his only son, on Mount Moriah, and the final climax of the story, which has become a meaning-making story for Jews and Christians and Muslims for generations after. So that's what we're going to do next, now that we've set the stage for Abraham and his world. So thank you. I'll see you next week, next month. And David has a question, but we'll have to do it after because we are out of time.
It's not an argument. It really is a question.